All right, thank you so much for joining us today for our June webinar session, Researching a Historic Building. I'm Becca Deershaw. I'm a senior city planner with the City of Denver. I've been working in preservation in Denver for over 10 years and have researched hundreds of historic properties in the city during that time. So today I'm going to show you how to research your own historic property. If at any time you have questions during the session, feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom section, or you can raise your hand and I will try and call on you. So today, just as a caveat, we're going to show you how to research historic buildings that are located in Denver specifically, because we'll be using the Denver Public Library for a lot of our resources. Many of the resources we discussed today are available online and can be accessed by all members of the public. For some of these materials, you're going to need a Denver Public Library card, or you may need to visit the central branch of DPL in person to access them. But I'll make a note of which is which of these materials as I go through my presentation. So people research properties for a whole host of reasons, because they're interested in history, the history of their own building or a building in their neighborhood that they walk by and feel like there must be a story there. Sometimes they do it as part of a school project, or if the building is in danger of demolition and they're interested in learning more about its past. By using records that are available online and at the library, you can find out a whole lot of information about a building, including its date of construction, its owners, its residents, and more. So the key thing to remember is this. It can be daunting to research a property for the first time, and there's a lot of information out there. But this tutorial should hopefully help you show you what resources are where and how you can use them to create a history of your own neighborhood. So we're going to start, we're going to use this building on the screen as my case study example building today. And there are many different ways to start researching a property, but I like to think of it in terms of first researching the building itself and then researching the people who lived in there. So here are my steps for when I begin to research a property. I first visit the Denver Assessor's website to get the address and legal description of the property. I then look at the historic Assessor's Records, which will provide me with a list of historic property owners. I look for a building permit to confirm the building's construction date and to provide an architect or owner if possible. I do historic maps to see if there are any major additions or changes to the building, and to get a visual sense of how the surrounding neighborhood developed. I then visit ancestry.com to view census records and city directories to learn more about the people associated with the building. I then search historic newspapers for more information on the property and the people who live there. And then I put this research into context by learning more about the history of the neighborhood and the surrounding area. So even though we're going to use even though we're going to use a residential example today, you can use this method and apply it to any commercial building, church, school, any building in the city and county of Denver. So before we dive into the actual research, it's a good idea to get familiar with Denver Public Library's digital archive. They have so much information that's available online and in person, and it's truly the basis of most of our research. You'll want to start with the genealogy section of the Genealogy, African American, and Western History Department. And we'll be returning to this list of resources later in the presentation, but it's a great place to start if you're new to this. And it gives me a chance to wax poetic about the Denver Public Library. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of DPL and their #1 supporter. This is where I first learned to research buildings over 10 years ago. They have a number of guides, research guides on how to do genealogy research and building research. But you can also reach out to the librarians at DPL through email, via phone, or by visiting the 5th floor of the central branch of the Denver Public Library downtown. You'll never meet a more helpful group of people. So let's get started on our own research with the house I showed you earlier. Step 1 is to visit the Denver Assessor's website and look for real property search. You'll be prompted to enter an address, as we see on the left here, and make sure to include the directional, so north, south, east, or west, or it may not pull up a result. Once you type your address, you'll get a record that looks like this. You'll want to note down the legal description, which is the third column over, so right here. This jumble of letters and numbers feels like a secret code, but once you figure out how to decipher it, you'll be able to unlock a wealth of information. The legal description describes the property in terms of which subdivision, block, and lot the property is located on. Historically, the address of a property may have changed several times, but the property's legal description generally stays the same. In this way, we can track the property's ownership throughout the decades. In this case, the legal description for this property is lot 19, so L19, block 10 of Waddle and Mackins subdivision. You'll use this legal description often, so make sure that you write it down or save it somewhere. The assessor's office also includes an effective year built right here. In this case, it's 1895. It's always important to confirm this date with a building permit or a newspaper record if possible. The assessor's record does not always include the correct date of construction, though it's usually correct. Sometimes it's been updated if there's been a major renovation or records were added later. So it's a good idea to double check that whenever you can. Oh, dear. Sorry about that. Okay. So once we have this legal description, we'll head back over to the Denver Public Library's digital collection. We'll use many different resources on DPL's website, but we'll start with our digitized copies of the historic record, assessor's records. These will give us a basic list of the property's historic owners. You can access the assessor record for the correct block using this map that you see on the screen. You'll want to zoom in on the correct block and then choose the dot, as you can see the yellow dot here, for the block that you're looking for. It will then bring up a historic assessor's map and record, as you can see here. For the older neighborhoods, there's usually several pages of assessor's records. Here we have 4 pages, but on newer buildings or subdivisions, there are often far fewer records. Before we get going, we want to double check that we have the right one. Many times you think you click the right dot and you click the wrong one, so we'll double check. So we'll use our legal description again to do this. So our legal description was lot 19 of block 10 of Waddle and Mackins subdivision. So as we can see, we're on the right block, block 10. And then here's lot 19. So we've got the right one, which is great, great first step. So these are what the assessor records are going to look like. And when you're on DPL's website, you can make them much larger so you can actually read every line. I'm going to start by looking for the owners of lot 19. The description is where you see which lots are being passed, the property is being passed between people. So here's our first entry. It's for Henry Gilbert, who bought the property in 1907. And that's an interesting fact, so that's 1907, because the assessor record we pulled up earlier shows that the property was built in 1895. So there's potentially an earlier owner who is not on this assessor's record. And so we're going to put a pin in that mystery, and we're going to come back to it later. We then see the next property owner, Jeannie Gilbert. It looks like this may have been for just a portion of the lots. It looks like the undivided 1/3 of 19. So that's another little mystery that we might want to look into. Going to the next page, we see that Bell Care purchased the property in 1923. And as you can see, it was granted by both of those, so it's the entire block. And then here's the last page of the assessor record, showing that Bell's children inherited the house upon her death in 1942. Unfortunately, these assessor records end in the early 1950s. So to continue our search for historic property owners, we can look at some of the later assessor records, which are also digitized by DPL, or city directories. In this case, there wasn't a DPL version of the later records, so I can't show you that. But we do have some information to go on. We have this list of owners. So we have a question mark about whether there was an earlier property owner from 1895 to 1907. And then we have Henry Gilbert, who owned it from 1907 to 1923. Then it was owned by Belle Kerr from 1923 to 1942. And then it was owned by her children from 1942 to an undetermined date. Next. So now that we have this list, we want to try and find out the building's construction date. So the Denver Public Library has digital copies of Denver building permits from 1889 to 1915. They're also in the process of digitizing building permits from 1915 to 1955. Unfortunately, there is a big hole in these early building permits, which is something to keep in mind. The city's building permits from 1892 to 1900 were destroyed at some point in history. I don't remember if it was a fire or water damage, some act of God, so they were never digitized. So for our building, which has a construction date of circa 1895, we don't have a building permit. However, I do want to show you what these documents look like. So I found a building permit for a house right down the street in the same subdivision to show you what they look like. So as you can see, this table lists the number of the building permit, when it was issued, and the various property information, such as the number of stories, the material, construction, and size. It also lists the building by legal description and its cross streets. And so this is part of the reason why it's so important to write down and have at our hands the legal description for the building. Many of these early permits did not have building addresses associated with them. We may also learn the property's architect, if there was one, the owner, and the builder. In this example, the builder designed and constructed this building for the owner. Another great place to look if you're trying to pin down when a building may have been constructed and look at construction details and chart changes to the structure are through a bunch of historic maps. And many of these are available on DPL's website. Here's a list on the left showing some of the maps that are available. We also have on the right a map of a 1933 historic aerial. This is a great way to see sort of the buildings in the mid-century. You can find this map by Googling 1933 Denver historic aerial, and it will come up. The first place we often look as historians are the Sanborn fire insurance maps. They're available through DPL, but you will need a library card to access them online. You can also visit the central branch downtown for hard copies of these. Now, these maps were designed to help insurance adjusters as they were making their rates and quotes. And so they're chock full of information about a building's material, construction, walls, roofs, about additions, how many stories the building has, even the number and types of windows. So it's a great resource to really get to know the historic character of your building. So to visit Sanborn Maps, you'll need to visit the DPL website and navigate to the research section and then to Sanborn Maps. Here's what will show up. You'll need to select the Denver, Colorado map. And there are several volumes of maps to choose from, including 1887, 1890, 1903 and 4, 1929, and 1951. So we're going to start by looking at the 1903-1904 volume. To do this and to navigate your way around, you'll start on the index page and you will try and find the neighborhood or area that you're looking for. So we're looking for something in the Spear neighborhood with cross streets at approximately Ellsworth and Washington. So we know that this is going to be in volume 3. So next, you'll navigate to volume 3, and there's another index page. And you'll look for your cross streets again and try and find the page number that you'd like to look at. In this case, it's going to be approximately page number 379. Now, if you're not quite sure, or if it's a little hard to read, I think that's 380, but it's a little hard. You can navigate to what you think is the right map, and then they always have the interconnecting map numbers at the edge of each page, which is really convenient if you're sort of looking around or if you're not quite sure where you are. So here's the 1904 sampler map, and you can see our structure right here. And you can see it was constructed and it has a sister house right next to it, a few houses along the block, but there's a lot of open land. So in 1903, this neighborhood was still sort of up and coming and not a lot had been built there. We can then look at the 1929 map and you'll see there's quite a dramatic difference. There are a lot more houses on the block surrounding it and on the block itself. And again, here's this house. It also looks like there has been some changes to the structure. It looks like the rear porch has been moved, and it looks like there's an accessory structure that was constructed at the rear of the property. So these are all great little details that we like to know. DPL also has several other maps that are available online. This is the based atlas from 1905. It's available through a mapping system, much like the Assessor Records. And so it's a pretty easy navigational tool. Here's the example of the structure on our 1905 based atlas. There's a little less information. The pink indicates that it's a masonry structure. Yellow indicates that it's wood. So as you can see, the house 3 doors down looks like it had a wood accessory structure. And the house right next to it looks like it had a brick accessory structure. We can also see where a school is and that there was a streetcar line just a few blocks away. So these atlases really, they give you a different sense of what was going on in the neighborhood. So the last thing that we want to do right now is understand the building style that we have before us. Landmark staff has done a fantastic 3-part presentation on architectural styles that you can view on our YouTube channel. Or you can look at a number of different books available online or at the 5th floor of the central branch of the Denver Public Library. Of course, the preeminent resource for architectural styles is the book Field Guide to North American Houses by Virginia McAllister. There also are Denver and Colorado specific style guides available from Historic Denver and History Colorado. And a number of state historic preservation offices have just put their style guides online for you to view at any time. So the house that we're researching, it looks up to be a Queen Anne style. We can see this style coming through in the front nested gables, in the asymmetrical front facade, with this turned wood front porch, and there are shingles in the gable end. All of these are really indicative of the style, and this helps us date the building. So the Queen Anne style was popular around the turn of the century, the late 1890s, especially here in Denver. And so that construction date of 1895, that seems to match up pretty perfectly. If, say, we had a construction date that said it was 1920, and this was the house we're looking at, we might have cause to question whether that construction date is right, given the nature of the style. So now that we have a good sense of our building's construction history, let's turn to the people who may have owned or lived in the structure. We have our list of property owners, so we head back to DPL. And this is where you're going to need to visit a library branch in person, but it's well worth the trip. So Ancestry.com is one of the best resources available for digital genealogy research. There's a huge amount of information that's available on the site, including census records that go from the 1880s to 1950, Denver City Directory, grave sites and memorials, World War I and II draft cards, naturalization records for anyone who immigrated to the country, marriage certificates, yearbooks, historic photos. And it also has a really large active user base who has created a ton of family trees and often shares their own pictures and memories of the people in their life. And sometimes they make those available to the public so you can learn a little bit more about them. So using these ancestry records, we can start to sketch a profile of the people who resided in the house. Census data will include things about a person's age, race, sex, as well as the members of their household. It may also include where they and their parents were from or were born, along with information about their occupation, their family composition, even the level of education. So here's an example of the 1910 census entry for Henry Gilbert, who was the first property owner that we know of for the property. And I'll zoom in. So this census information shows us that Henry is living with his wife, Jeannie, and his father, Henry Sr. We can also see that Henry and his wife are quite young. They're 28 and 27. They've been married for a year. We can see that Henry Jr. was born in New York and Jeannie was born in Nebraska. And that Henry was working as a chauffeur for the water company, which is not a profession I've seen before, which is interesting. So every census asks for slightly different information, so don't be surprised if it doesn't look exactly like you see here. And it's a good idea to repeat your search with each property owner so that you get a good sense of who lived there and worked in your building and what they were like. So if you can't visit DPL in person, but you have a library card, you can access some of this information through DPL and some stuff that Ancestry actually doesn't have. For example, through DPL, you can visit the Denver city directories in addition to the householder directories. So city directories are like your standard phone book. They're arranged alphabetically by last name. But householder directories are a little different. They're arranged by address. I'll pull one up. So if you don't have a property's owner's last name, or if your property was owned by someone and rented out by someone else, and you don't know their name, you can look up the property by this address in the householder directory and find out who was living there. And in this case, this is from this is later. So Frank and Belle Kerr lived at the house, which was the second of the owners that we saw from the Assessor Records. So there are plenty of additional resources that might be helpful to you. Historic newspapers can be a great resource for finding obituaries, news items, social events, anything you want about the property owners or the residents. In many ways, the historic newspapers were like the historic Facebook. They put notices that they were going to visit friends or that they had a party, and you can really get a good sense of the culture that they were living in at the time. And I always search for the property owners, but I also search for just that street address as well. You'll uncover some really interesting gems. You'll find for sale ads, or like this one, renting out the room. There are police reports that were associated with the address, marriage and birth notices. There's so many good finds. And the Colorado Historic Newspaper Collection is an absolute must visit for any budding genealogist. They have newspapers digitized from all across Colorado, including Denver. So you can search, if someone moves from Adams County into Denver, you can track that and things like that. So it's a really great resource. And sometimes if you're especially lucky, you'll find real estate transfers in these newspapers and notices of building permits or advertisements of architects or builders who have built a structure that may not have been in the assessor records or may come from an assessor record. So for example, a newspaper search helped me fill in some of the gaps of the property that we're looking at today, its ownership history. I found two previous owners who transferred the property, one in 1903 and one in 1905. So that brings me a little closer to the full property ownership of the property, though we're still missing the original owner. And then of course, to round out your search, I say never underestimate a Google search. If you just put in quotes the first name and the last name plus Denver plus their profession, end quote, you will often pull up the most random of things, from trade publications, from digitized newspapers and magazines that other institutions have done. The power of Google is really surprising. So do not underestimate Google. So once you get a good understanding of your property's history and owners, it's time to get some context. It's a great idea to visit DPL's website to learn more about your neighborhood. Discover Denver, a citywide building survey, run by Historic Denver and the City of Denver, is also great research. They have short articles on the history of Denver and certain neighborhoods, and they're adding more all the time. So this information will help you understand the context in which your building was constructed and the people who live there. So for instance, with my property that's built in 1895, I'm going to look to this historic context that's titled The Fall and Rise of the Queen City of the Plains, and get an understanding about, what was happening in the 1890s. This was right after the silver crash. Denver was kind of reeling from that and starting to form a new identity. So what was happening? Who were the people who were living in Denver at the time and in this Spear neighborhood? There are also many books dedicated to the history of different Denver neighborhoods, many of which are held by detail on the 5th floor in the Western History Department. So definitely, again, worth a visit down there because you'll find some things that you can't access online or on Amazon or anything like that, books that are out of print and such. So we've concluded the first part of our research. And so the question is, what have we learned? Here's a little brief house biography that I put together for this property. So 72 South Washington was constructed circa 1895 in the Queen Anne style. Early owners included Henry Gilbert, a chauffeur, and Frank and Belle Kerr. And Frank was a fruit salesman. And it's pretty cool to think that a fruit salesman could afford that house in the early 1900s. And this building was owner occupied. The house is one of the earlier structures on the block, and the neighborhood was well developed in the 1930s. It's one of several Victorian era homes on the block. So the Spear neighborhood is centrally located in Denver and is a mix of single family and multifamily residential areas. It's near to many historic districts, including Alamos Lacita and the Baker neighborhood. And it's an interesting historic area that was named after Spear Boulevard and Mayor Robert Spear. Spear Boulevard serves as the northern boundary for the neighborhood. And further research into the history of the neighborhood is needed. I did not find an easy history for the area, but I think with a little more digging, we could really bring some life to our understanding of the Spear neighborhood. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully this gives you a taste of the numerous resources available to you through the Denver Public Library and the magic of the internet. Researching your historic property can be a lot of fun and lead you down many research rabbit hole. And if you liked this, I would encourage you to tune in to my colleague Kara's presentation next month, which will be on writing a historic designation, which is one way that you can use the information that you've discovered here.